Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Cannabis Accounting Podcast. Today I have with me Mike Siebold, partner with Brightpoint and formerly a managing partner of Flower Hire, which was a recruiting and talent agency, and Brightpoint is on the restructuring and receivership side of the cannabis industry. I like chatting with Mike just because he's a wealth of knowledge as a three-time founder and investor. He just kind of gets the idea of startups and scaling them and exiting and kind of all the twists and turns and pivots that happen in between. But Mike, I'll kick it over to you to introduce yourself formally to the audience.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ray. I'm excited. It's funny. This podcast came about because Ray and I would sit down for an hour and just geek out. So I love the idea of it being formalized and having some contours around it. Where to start? Yeah, I mean, cannabis, high school, right?
Bring it back to high school.
Way
How did you
back,
get into it?
kind of the genesis story.
Yes.
Smoking cannabis, not trying to figure out why, just knowing that it was a social scenario that was fun. It was a thing that I enjoyed and shared with friends. The thing that kind of flipped the switch on the idea of trying to think about it in a deeper way was when I actually got to undergrad. Uh, I took a class at Columbia in New York called Drug Use and Abuse, another class called Drugs and Behavior. It was standing room only. And the gentleman that was running the class was named and is named Dr. and Professor Carl Hart. He actually came out with a book recently called Drug Use for Grown-Ups not too long ago. And I was in this class and it was interesting to talk about psychosensory anything, right? We were talking about why drugs are part of the cultural experience, right? Why does America sing songs about something that's prohibited, like weed? And I never thought about it before. I never tried to qualify, the social scenarios about weed or the prohibition of it. I never thought about it because it never was really, there was always an interaction that wasn't stopped. It always seemed kind of natural, despite the fact they would do really weird things to get it. I mean, future generations will think it's alien that you bought weed from someone like in a bathroom and you didn't really know them either, right? Like that, that's going to be so odd for my kids once they're of age. So, I started having a lot of questions about weed and was really interested in it. But that at the time, this was 2005, 2006 in academia. So this was a hobby, but it did coincide with me meeting someone through that class called or named Ethan Nadelman, who is the founder of the Drug Policy Alliance, the DPA. He's actually now a board member of GTI. And the DPA was where we started talking about things like, the regulatory framework that could exist, right? Talking about legalization efforts, right? Because there was an effort. It wasn't much of a strong one at the time, but
Mhm.
yeah, there was always the discussion that this could be something that's going to be legitimized in some shape or format, right? We didn't know about federal prohibition being entirely lifted, but we knew that there was some semblance of acceptance bound to occur. And, that always was in the background as I progressed in my career. Consumer packaged goods, my girlfriend, who's now my wife, we started a business in Brooklyn. And that was like the first time I was doing anything that was manufacturing based. That was also a startup that had a lot of the same requirements and experience of a lot of CPG founders that happen to overlap a lot with early stage participating founders in the cannabis space. So I got a kitchen table MBA really quickly about what it's like to be an entrepreneur. Again, all the while cannabis being in the background, right?
What
And
type of
then
pies were you making?
what's that?
What type of pies were you making?
No, they weren't pies. They were s'mores.
S'mores.
Yeah.
Okay, so you were manufacturing s'mores. They'd come like pre-packaged s'mores, like graham cracker, marshmallow, chocolate, or was it supplies to make s'mores?
So when we started, it started a food market that's still there called Smorgasburg in Brooklyn. And
Okay.
everything was made to order. And then someone would just say, well, why don't you just drop ship these? And that coincided with e-com and foodstuffs like in and around Brooklyn. So like Etsy had just opened up in Brooklyn right there. And
Okay.
so we started doing an online shop and drop ship it all around the country. We made kits, we made smaller packets, and we were lucky. It really did well. But it also was funny, Ray, because like I thought I was selling s'mores, but it turned out I was selling nostalgia. So it turned out that,
The business behind the business.
yeah, I think
Okay.
that's the interesting thing. I think that's always
Nice.
fun about it was that like you start seeing different interpretations about things, which really served me well once we got into the legal cannabis space because at
Mhm.
first blush you have conceptions and that are actually misconceptions. So you constantly have to kind of think about what is the underlying motive with lots of these
Mhm.
things. But yeah, I mean that was a really good precursor to just knowing and seeing firsthand just how much you have to do, which really helped me understand kind of the psyche of what a lot of founders have to contend with when they're building these businesses, right? It's just like multidisciplinary and all the strain and the pressure that comes down on you. But in weed, that's compounded, right? Like that, this is an environment that's much different than traditional CPG.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, then after kind of the manufacturing, and that's even a unique thing too of manufacturing a product that has a relatively short shelf life and is consumed by humans. It's like a little bit different than a tool or a widget. So then what'd you do after that? Kind of how did your business, kind of and I like the hands-on learning of business ownership and scaling. So what did you do after that? I kind of know you segued into tech a little bit.
So I came over to California, and I actually got linked up with a group called Fortis Partners that was working with, at the time it was called Silicon Beach, right? So it was kind of an offshoot of Silicon Valley. It was early stage companies in tech, which was kind of my first intersection. I was seeing, groups going from manufacturing where, there is some investment, of course, but not to the degree that I was seeing in some of these tech companies, Snapchat, Tinder, a lot of groups under the IAC umbrella here in Los Angeles. And I also saw not just kind of the executive function and just the hyper growth, but also kind of find this selective talent pool. It was a group that did one part advisory and one part recruitment. And I've never been good at recruitment, and I'll say that out loud, like I'm just not good at it. But I started looking at the organizational orchestration, like what is it like to build something very quickly in a very short period of time and qualifying it for the first time. A lot of these businesses knew what to pay certain people and how to position them, but how do you communicate responsibility, right? How do people that are gaining access to these businesses that are becoming managers for the first time, what are their soft and hard skills? How do you qualify them? And so it was just another kind of piece of the education that I've been having with startups. This was just a different complexion because companies were raising money, no questions asked at the time.
So that's
Um,
kind of what I want to hit on. Like that's kind of a different environment where it's so because obviously manufacturing, even if it is s'mores, it's like it's been around forever. So it's like investors in that, it's a unique investor. But then tech, relatively new, early 2000s, 2010s. So kind of could you just dive into that? Like, I was going to ask, why did you move out to California from New York? Like Brooklyn seems cool. That's where, Biggie's from. Like, why the difference? What made you move out to California?
my girlfriend at the time, who's now my
Been
wife,
there, brother.
yeah, we went out. It was February, or no, it was November, right? It was around
Okay.
Thanksgiving because meeting family, and
Yep.
I was like, well, this is pretty nice, right? It's warm. Um, and so I always knew that I wasn't going to be in the tri-state area. I wanted to try something new, and California, especially Southern California at the time, and still is, was really exciting, right? There were
Yeah.
new and emerging everything, right? Including manufacturing and CPG.
Yeah.
So I took a waiver. I'm like, let's go out and try. And I've been there. I've been here since. It's been a decade and change since.
So a decade and change. And then what was kind of the environment going? Because I kind of always chuckle to myself, like working with hyper growth or fast growth companies, it's like, well, anybody who's really spent a tremendous amount of time talking to business owners knows, like, whether they admit it or not, every business owner wants to grow, ideally hyper quickly, so we can pay back everything, get the life that we want. Because they're humans at the end of the day. They're like husbands and wives and fathers and mothers that like they want to get a good life for them, their family, and then there's this whole other world that I know of where they're like, oh no, we exclusively work with hyper growth and like fast growing companies. And it's like, well, if it's such a replicable thing that people can literally specialize in fast growth startups, like what is that? It's like, can you tell me a little bit about your experience? Like, is it just the capital? Clearly, it's not just the capital because
Yeah.
there's lots of companies that have raised capital and didn't grow quickly, and some of them
Yeah.
even went out of business. So I guess if you were gonna say like top one, two, or three, like what are some things that are like a throughput of these fast growing companies where you're like, okay, this company is, if structured correctly, could grow quickly? Because I think everybody wants to grow fast. So it's like, from your experience, what actually makes a fast growing company?
Yeah. I mean, well, a lot of, first off, I think inundating a business with as much money as it needs, no questions asked, is a terrible equation because you can get pretty irresponsible pretty quickly and believe that you'll be kind of absolved of those issues because you have enough money to cover your ass, right? So I first want to say that I've seen people in and out of cannabis in tech raise huge sums of money and squander it because of the fact that they always knew that there was going to be enough there. All the while, the valuations are dipping and the growth trajectory is not being met. I mean, the thing that I always noticed about businesses that were usually better situated was that the founders always had some kind of like mentorship group, right? They surrounded themselves with expertise in so many different avenues, not even necessarily in the same space. And that was kind of a calm, cool, collective way for them to get grounded. I mean, it's so frenetic, right? Especially with some of these businesses that, I saw firsthand, just how much they had to do in such a short period of time. And because they raised money, there was an evil necessity to basically not just grow, but continue to grow at a very healthy clip on a continuous basis, no questions asked, right? They were compelled to grow and they fell prey to their own growth story. The ones that I
Hmm.
saw that did very well had mentorship groups, networks, people to confide in, advisors that were able to ask them questions in real time, right? It's a big
Yeah.
luxury for any founder to stop amidst, like the onslaught of to-dos and to asks and to all the things that you have to do to qualify if the direction you're going in is the one that you want to go in, the one that you're comfortable going in, the one that your team can keep up with. And so I
Hmm.
always noticed that first. The ones that ended up being more successful really had a great cohort in a very weird, eclectic array of, expertise, insight, people that would basically constantly question the motives behind the moves. And that was really, really beneficial. So the first thing I saw was any executive team worth their salt had people to confide in, not just saying, I don't know what to do here, or what do you think I should do? But saying like point blank, I'm not necessarily sure what my next step should be. Like I don't even know what the next hour should be. And so that was that radical candor, right, behind the curtain always translates to the next most important thing, which is interactions and communication with everyone on your team. I think
Yeah.
people always talk about, companies are families, and that's a nice sentiment, but it's the better thing to say is they're familial. They're family-like, right? You should be able to have radical candor. You should be able to call people
Yeah.
out when they promised that they would do something and they didn't, right? Not to do passive aggressive stuff, but to be very honest about what you're both trying to do in real time together as a collective. And most importantly, communicating when people are not being as communicative as they need to be. So I always noticed that businesses that usually had a great HR leader, a chief people officer, or middle management, also training and development, right? That's usually the third point too. Those work hand in hand. Communication alongside training and development. Not only did they hire best in class people, but they worked on their skills, right? Which is inclusive of communication, right? Which is inclusive of setting an agenda and a priority. And also, most importantly, showcasing the fact that people wanted to own and operate not just the way that they wanted to, but looking alongside what people are able to do, right? And looking at the personality characteristics and the quirks, looking at the obligations that people have outside the workplace and being considerate towards that. So those three things, right? Having a mentorship and advisory network around you as a founder, owner, operator, having whether it's an HR function or just, a communication style that was led by not indecisiveness, but discussion, conversation, obligations, commitment.
Yeah.
And then last part was training and development, making sure that people on a reoccurring basis, not episodic when it needed to happen because people were slipping, but constantly bringing people back to the front end with the idea of them being able to improve themselves, not with what they do, but how they do it and who they are and making them better professionals.
That is interesting, right? Because it's like you need a good product, you need the capital to get it to market, but like all that's like table stakes, like that's expected in a lot of these companies. But then it's like, all right, who's actually running the business and who are they getting their
Right.
mentorship from? Because ideas do just they do come a dime a dozen. And yes, maybe sometimes there's a new idea and it truly like changes and disrupts everything. But most businesses are just somebody's doing this business, but they're just doing it slightly poorly. I think I could do it slightly better. And that's why, then you're born. And so that's like a very interesting thing. And then, yeah, obviously like training communication amongst the team. Cause it's like businesses are still ran by people. It's like, yes, AI is going to disrupt a lot of things and it is coming and it's awesome, but it's still predominantly a lot of people doing business with people at this point. And so you can't
Yeah.
really get around that.
Well, it's
Um,
also keep in mind, like everyone that joins your business is it's not just about the job that they're doing or how they represent themselves out in public. Like they don't have to be a brand ambassador outside the workplace. But most people are unhappy, if not downright miserable in their job, right? And that
yeah.
that like that's a cultural understanding, right?
Yep. Yeah.
And
Yep.
I always thought to myself that it's okay to look at people viewing your opportunity within your business as a job or a career as a calling, right? Some people really want to commit themselves. Some people need to be coaxed into that. Some people just want to, be rank and file, punch in and punch out, which is just as fine. Like it really is. A lot of people are
Totally.
not going to give you 1,000% because they're unable to, or they just don't feel an inclination towards it. I think it's
No.
really important to be candid about the fact that everyone has the ability to make a better workplace, a better work experience, which always leads to typically better consumer experience at a minimum, right? Better recognition of your business as a solid business, a dependable business, a predictable business, a growth-oriented business. And it's also the fact that, like, as a person, it should feel good knowing that the majority of people that work around you, across from you, up and down from you are gaining access to mobility, right? They feel good about what they're doing. They
Yeah.
feel like they're being successful, right? Because imagine just the kind of slog it is to punch in every day and not enjoy a single thing that you're doing, considering that you have a very limited time span of life, right? That should be
Yeah.
so
Yeah. And then we're gonna
depressing.
die. Yeah.
Yeah, like, I don't want to be morbid, but, and I also don't want to be, like a business romantic where like everyone can have fun. That's not true, right? Some jobs are inherently not fun.
And even the
But
fun jobs, there's still stuff that needs to get done there. It's like you're not just pumped all the time. Every job
yeah,
has, if it's a real job, has things you got to do that are just like they're not the favoriteest part of the job.
Yeah, I mean that's the point, right? Like sometimes when someone has to enter a period, right? Like just before we jumped on, you talked about the rush to get taxes done, right? This is crunch
Yep.
for you, right? It
Mhm.
just has to get done, right? Now, knowing that people alongside you are just as committed, and then the nice commentary that you can have between you during a crunch period, it doesn't change the period itself, but it does change your feeling and your experience of it, right? You
Oh
feel
yeah.
that support and you feel that camaraderie. It makes it that much easier to navigate. And that's what I'm saying. I think that can permeate not all, but a majority of the work days if you make that an intention as a culture and as a company.
No, 100%. I was just done. I was chatting with my teammate, and kind of it is the same thing. And that's why I like just kind of talking about just the kind of like not the emotional side, but it is it's like the culture. They call it like culture at your business, but it is. It's like there's this shared culture, but kind of taking a step back, more of like a focus on the cannabis industry. Kind of obviously, you started Flower Hire. It's mainly a exclusively a cannabis industry recruiting company, and so kind of thinking from that lens, just when you talk to people outside of the cannabis industry thinking about working for the cannabis industry for the first time or a new company within the cannabis industry, what do you tell them about the cannabis industry? How is that conversation going today? And I guess how has it changed from when you started Flower Hire?
All right, so correction. When I did not start Flower Hire, David, my partner, when I met him, I think Flower Hire was about a year old at the time. This coincided with Ease in Southern California, kind of like coming up in the world. And that
My
business kind of
apologies.
coincided with that growth.
Yep.
David has been a career recruiter and is one of the best that you're going to be in the cannabis space, bar none. Like actually. And when I met him, he actually wanted me to be a candidate for an early stage participating brand in Southern California because, I had the CPG experience, the manufacturing, right? Like maybe it's congruent, but it didn't work. But when I got back to him, I said, I was thinking about this on the drive to and from the conversation I just had. And you're building this business. And going back to the idea what I originally said about the idea of like, the concept, right? Oh, I was selling s'mores. No, I was actually, selling nostalgia.
Yep.
I looked at his business and I'm like, people will view this as a recruitment firm, but what you're really trafficking is in talent, right? Esoteric talent, right? Like thinking about it out loud. There's no global consensus on how to grow weed, let alone what to pay for it. And I started thinking to myself, this business could do very, very well. And it was doing very well at the time, right? The team in place at the time was seeing first, for first time, the velocity that came with adult use in California. And I signed up and I said, let me work and coincide with the growth story of this business and see if I can format and structure it in a way where we can start not just winning all of the business, but really kind of get into, more of a nuanced approach. Because again, I'm not a very good recruiter. I'm not going to be a good recruiter, but I do know a lot about weed. And so lo and behold, we built that business out and have built since then, subsequently, lots of locations and team members across the states, right? It's sprungboard from 11 adult use now into what, almost 24, 25. So,
Yep.
the thing that happened though, and going back to your question about what was the commentary when I started in and where's the commentary now, for a lot of people viewing this that have been a part of the fabric for a long time, there was nothing but exuberance, right? The catalyst in 2017, 2018 was the fact that Canada had just gone as the third nation after Uruguay to entirely decriminalize weed, right? So our northern border friends created a marketplace where the entire geography of it was going to be totally accepting of the commercial experience of weed. And then lo and behold, right after, almost directly following that, adult use officially landed in California. Not only just one of the largest GDPs in the world, but also kind of the cultural intersection for weed, right? Like
Yep.
the Emerald Triangle up north, Mendo, Trinity, Humboldt, right? You had a
Yep.
lot of, you had the Bay and the idea of entrepreneurship kind of already, no pun, being baked into the idea of California. So at the time, there was nothing but massive speculation, right? People were absolutely sure that all of these businesses and the equity involved with them were going to not just generate and keep huge sums of money, but also for everyone involved meant millionaires left, right, and center. So the dialogue at the time was this is a new and emerging space, right? That if you attach yourself to it, you'll have access to opportunity and career growth that really can't be mimicked outside of it, right? That was the MO.
Okay.
And the cultural DNA was, you need to be entrepreneurial, sure, gritty, determined, right? Like use whatever euphemism for like, working really hard. Now, the way it's changed over time is the same. You can still enter the space and there still can be a lot of career mobility. The difference now, though, is instead of exuberance, raising money, no questions asked, and basically expansion with really no thought about the idea of it being detrimental, now there's a conservative nature to it. You have to really be thoughtful about every single, financial, operational move that you make because the environment is much more constricted. In the way that you're able to raise money, no questions asked, now you have to have operational prowess and a thesis and a business that is almost ironclad to raise just a little bit of money. So, the thing that has changed is the sentiment, despite the fact that the growth story, if you were to look at it on a market by market basis, is the same. Minnesota just started adult use a few weeks ago, right?
Yep. Yeah, we were just there, and it's like fantastic. And it's like Ohio was before then, and it's like
Correct.
New York was before then. It's like there's this continuous adult use markets continue to open up. They take a little bit of time to get retail doors open, but it's continuous for at least consistent. I
It's
won't say
consistent, right? Like it's that's the thing that's interesting about the idea of it being an industry versus a space, which is it's growing, but informally, right? It's growing not like as a category, it grows, but if you look at a market by market basis, some of them are not doing as well. Some of them are actually failing. Some of them are actually in decline
yeah,
because of
contributing.
oversaturation, right? Because of overbuilding. So the thing that I noticed that I wanted to bring alongside David that we were able to accomplish was just kind of looking at, this space as something that is going to be remarkably different wherever we go, but we have to try to build wherever we go our standards to work from, right?
Yeah.
Building insights, building best in class prospectus in terms of talent, building the idea of, what does an organization look like at this stage, then the next stage and the next stage? What is it like when you have to reformat a business, right? So it was great because all we had were a lot of clients that had lots of gaps with no real addressable knowledge. And so we went on a run and tried to address those as much as we could through conversation, through dialogue, through conference, as much as we could, as often as we could.
Okay. No, that is really interesting. And you just mentioned the different stages that the companies go through, and I kind of just wanted to get your take on stages because we definitely think about our clients in stages as well, just because it's like their requirements at different stages are going to be different. And we kind of think of it as a combination of top line sales and profitability. And so are you pre-revenue? That's phase one. Like we're literally just raising capital, getting the license, getting the real estate, building it out, getting to that grand opening. And because there's still new markets, like there's a ton of pre-revenue. So it's pre-revenue, post-revenue, then profitable is phase three. And then once they're profitable, then they can worry about scaling to new locations or scaling current operations. But that's kind of how we think through the four phases. But from like a recruiting lens, how do you think through the four phases of a business and how do their needs change in each phase?
Yeah, I mean, so the thing that you raised that's really important is the idea of a lot of unknown, right?
Yeah.
At what stage, what do you need? In an early stage participating company, an early stage marketplace, we know that we're going to sell, we just don't know how much. right? And those companies in real time are trying to figure out supply chain and logistics and distribution and brand and consideration, right? Like there's so many things that they have to, at its most basic level, qualify and then collaborate with, right? Whether it's under their umbrella or with somebody else. And there's financial restrictions there. A lot of early stage businesses that like, they always say like I've soft circled, the funds, right? I have people involved, I have friends and family, right? Which is not a misnomer. Like it's not that they're trying to be dishonest. It's the fact that it's contingent
Those
on something, right?
Yeah, yeah, and those days are long gone. It's like it was much more reliable, a soft circle,
Yeah,
2018 to 2022. It's like nowadays, it's like until we kind of have like signed contracts and ideally money in the bank, like it's hard to build, but you got to start a budget from somewhere. You can't just throw your hands in the air and be like, I don't know. So they
right.
start with a soft circle, but I agree. It's like they got to get started somewhere, and then kind of what's the next phase after they're going past that one?
Well, the initial phase is always, I need to hire for, I have a role in mind, right? And the question we always have to that, which is not if the role, but what is that function? Like, what will they actually be doing, right? Because a lot of titles are really misleading. A director of operations, right? That there are so many interesting, interpretations of that title, right? Most director of operations are just a chimera. They're doing like four or five way different disciplines between security, marketing, retail, right? Like it's kind of challenging. So the first thing we have to do is qualify. And then you have to be very frank and very honest at the early stage saying about budget restriction, right? You might want to hire for skill, but you might only be able to afford necessity, right? You might be only able to actually provide an opportunity for someone that doesn't have expertise that you have, right? Yeah, they might not be able to join at this current junction. So you have to be kind of candid with the ability of the business at hand, what they're able to afford, and be very candid about, all right, there's necessity, potential, and expertise, right? Okay, you can hire potential, someone that has worked in this role, right? That's worked in an industry that's parallel, right? Or there's someone with cannabis expertise, right? That's local to you, right? Again, a lot of it's based off jurisdiction. There might not be a talent pool in proximity. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
qualifiers early stage, right? Are these people nearby, or do you have to get them out of state? If you're hiring a director of cultivation in the middle of nowhere, what's going to be required for that person to live and breathe inside, that facility on an ongoing basis. So just questions, right? Circumstantial evidence, right? Understanding the budget and the restriction. Now, if and when that business has gotten to a place where they have consumers, they're delighting consumers, right? The revenue engine is like full bore, right? They're generating cash, not cash flow, but cash. Then they start thinking about, reinvesting into the business for some operational needs that they have. Now, at that point, you can find people that kind of complement the person that you previously hired, or you bring in, full time the person that might be an advisory capacity. The interesting thing about that moment in time when people have, more discretionary investment opportunity is you still have to ask just as many questions, probably even more, right? Because a lot of people
Yeah.
take the first sign of life and say, all right, my business is safe. It's like, well, hold on. Like, let's just be honest about the fact that you're generating lots of revenue, but you're not keeping the majority of that revenue. So let's be cautious and thoughtful about this next hire. Because keep in mind, a bad hire is terrible in any circumstance. In cannabis, it compounds. It is such a huge loss when
Yeah.
you hire incorrectly, or you're not able to onboard someone effectively, or train and develop them, in an efficient way. So there's also that component too, which is let's just say you can hire up for someone that can really complement your business. How are you going to be able to facilitate a dialogue with them to know what they need to do every day, right? The self-starter that you're looking for from a personality, if they don't have cannabis expertise, are you going to be willing to train that person, have the patience to ramp them, to get them acclimated to what it's like to buy weed on a spot market, right? Someone that worked at a CPG firm will have no experience buying something in an informal marketplace. That's a whole new different dynamic. What is your process to train and develop that person? So as the progressive process goes along, and as these businesses get more solidified, right, you have to ask more questions and to make sure that, they're being radically transparent about what they're able to do and what they have in mind for that individual in that role. And then the latter stages, right, like late stage cannabis companies, sometimes it's you have to go through restructuring. Maybe you have overhired, right? Or maybe you have had too much of a focus on one person doing too many things. And we're starting to see kind of, the social and the commercial fabric start to fray a little bit. So latter stage cannabis businesses in this moment in time are really about either confirming that you need to restructure or need to make changes from an operational and managerial standpoint, and or complementing it. Maybe you need to find someone that can take off some of that load for that person not to be such a choke point. So no matter what stage you're in, though, you really have to ask and ask and ask and ask questions. And it can be tedious and it can be kind of frustrating. But once you get down to it and you really get an orientation around the life of the business and where it is, then you can start making more efficient recommendations, which can lead to better financial outcomes and business outcomes.
No, it makes sense to me kind of how you think through it from a talent and people perspective. It's like drive sales. If we don't have sales and cash coming in, it's like we don't really have a business. We just have an idea. So it's like we need to drive sales. But then the founders and the investors and lenders, like they're not going to stick around unless they get paid. So once we have nice that hefty sales, phase two, expand profits. And it's like you don't hire more salespeople to expand profits. Sorry. It's like you don't hire more cultivation and product manufacturing people to expand profits. Like I'm biased because I'm an accounting finance person. Like that's where we come in. It's like I always tell people like I don't drive sales, I drive profits. That's
Well,
literally why most companies are ran by finance people. But then third is like restructuring. And like that's kind of what I want to talk about because it's you said it so nicely, but like for me, I'm like I kind of have like most people, it's like they think of negative connotations, usually because they're on like the wrong end of restructuring. But I guess like but it's natural. The company's either working out and it's growing, or it's not really working out, but it's like they've already hit profitability, they've expanded somewhat or scaled to some level, they have assets. It's like, how do we squeeze more juice out of these assets? And sometimes it is a restructuring. And so, kind of, can you touch on that a little bit? Because I know that's a main focus of yours now, of just like,
yeah,
age, why is there such a negative connotations and how do we give restructuring a positive spin? And then I guess just kind of who initiates the process of
sure.
restructuring that conversation? Because it's again, it's like nobody almost wants to admit it, where it's like, hey, I think we need to talk. But so
Well,
yeah, could you touch a little bit on that?
yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, which is the thing you mentioned about like sales, right? Like the bonus program, like drive sales. All right, but where's recuperation and remuneration for somebody that's working really hard? One of the things that I noticed that was great about the work with Flower Hire and with David and team was, you know, one of the things that we were constantly looking at were all the contributing factors that made anyone successful in a role, right? But we also looked at the organization itself, like how much of something do you need for 40,000 square feet of a cultivation site, right? How many people actually make sense for a retail store? And, it was happenstance at first. You would just, it was organic. You would talk to and work with enough retail stores to kind of have like, a wayward idea about what makes sense, right?
Yeah.
If it was a high foot traffic corridor, then you would maybe adjust accordingly, right? So your GM actually needs to be overseeing 13 people versus eight, right? Which is a big difference. But
Hmm.
what we started to do that was fun about the idea of assembling businesses was we got further involved. I mean, think of it this way. You have clients where you sit down and like, they tell you, they're telling you like the recent like issue, right? They're commiserating about something inside the space, which is totally natural, right? People confide in you because they trust you because, you are doing the
Yeah, I'm like
service
the
for
money
them.
guy. It's like, all right, we didn't hit our numbers this year or this month. It's like we
Right.
overspent here. It's like there's always something to talk about on the money side.
Exactly. Like there are people that confide in you or have
Yes,
confession, right? Like, I don't know what to do.
every
And
week.
what's interesting is progressively over the years, what we thought were gaps were actually, and themes were actually like structural faults. And so we
Okay.
built an advisory practice with a focus on complementing these businesses' growth cycles, right? Instead of just placing people into roles, what if we were able to kind of fashion a dialogue around, how many people and what kind of role need to exist in order for this business to be like what's domestic best practice for building X, Y, and Z? And that was the interesting thing about having a wide lens on the space. We looked at best practice and started applying it in conversation with early stage market participants. Like, oh, you're going to open
Okay.
3 dispensaries. Here's what's typical in terms of the number of bud tenders involved, right? Here's your typical pay grade for your inventory manager, right? That was in there too. What do I pay someone that grows weed early
Yeah.
stage in Ohio for,
Yep.
like that indoor? So what we started doing was addressing all of those systematic experiences. And my partner Jason DeSense and I built the HR advisory component to focus just on that alone. And he's currently now the chief people officer at Toshiba, right? So I was lucky because I
Nice.
learned alongside him what it's like to org. And he'd also built Gage, right, which sold to TerraSense. So he knew a lot about
Mhm.
building, what became private, then public cannabis businesses that ballooned in size, but always was really thoughtful about not getting inundated with too much overhead, right? Because the cost is extreme. Your payroll is your biggest cost, bar none, by a lot as a business.
Yeah.
And so as we were assembling these businesses and doing recruitment, it became very apparent that we're entering this next stage as a space, as an industry, where all the exuberance that started 7, 8 years ago, all the, we're all kind of like overfed and malnourished, all the easy money, no questions asked, and the growth story has led to a moment in time where we have to start reformatting and restructuring these businesses. Now, you're right about restructuring. People see that word almost like the way they view debt.
Or
Debt is not a
failure.
debt is not a bad word. It's a tool.
Yeah.
Restructuring is just a process, and it's a progressive process. I mean, sometimes restructuring is not changing overhead. That's the first thought that people have. Sometimes it's just, making tweaks and augmenting the way that you do certain processes, right? A lot of it is your collections, right? Just being and having a progressive third party that can do it independently to free up more time. But the restructuring process
Yeah.
is really fascinating because it's either one of two groups: founder, owner, operator, CEO of a business is trying to reconcile some facet of the financial business, right? Like it's not performing the where it needs to be, and the burn is exceptionally high, or the profitability is skewing down. I need to make changes, but I don't know necessarily where, right? I need to do an
Yep.
operational audit. Where am I misallocating people, time, resources, materials? Do I have a lost leader somewhere in my portfolio of a business? The other group is typically also the lender, right? The people that have been providing the financial durability up to this point are saying, look, we don't know if there's much of a there in terms of an investment thesis, but you have reneged on your promises to us in terms of performance, right? You're not paying us back on time.
Yeah, I love the you explained this in such a nice way. And I'm just like, all he's talking about is where am I losing money? Why am I not able to cover my debt and service my debt? But I keep explaining it the way you do it because it sounds much nicer and compelling. But
Well, I mean, I'm trying to be thoughtful about it because the majority of people are not public companies,
no, they're
right? They're
all
not, they're,
privately held. Like all of our clients are privately held.
they're
I
all
would say like
private.
90%. Yeah,
They tend to they're hyper regional, they're hyper local, they're
hyper
not
local.
institutional capital, they're friends and family. And so I want to be thoughtful about the fact that people have put their life savings into something
Yeah,
that they
no, I
truly
appreciate
believe.
that. That makes because it
Yeah.
is.
That
It's not like a big company that's like, oh, they went out of business. Like every that makes the papers. Everybody hears about the big 100 million, $1 billion companies, but like I'm with you
right.
100%. It's like, no, these are like small mom and pop privately held companies. The vast majority by like absolute count of cannabis companies, the vast majority are small. Maybe they don't sell the most amount of cannabis, but it's like a really intense thing. And but yeah, it's like the numbers, anybody can look at the numbers, but what's the story behind them? Is it a person thing? Is it a personnel thing? Is it a process or like a direction thing and like getting past just the numbers to the actual story? But you've seen that whole arc though. That's amazing to go from like recruiting to kind of restructuring, and it's just amazing. But to your point, kind of keep going down the path because like I kind of still think of it as negative, but it's not failure, it's pivoting. And as we know in business, that's how this business is done. Like you got to pivot in startup world. It's
Well, maybe the better thing to say is it's not only failure, right? Sometimes it is failure. Here's the other truth that a lot of people don't want to say out loud. It's not an unpopular
It's
opinion.
just,
It's
you know,
it's a natural truth, right? When a market starts, the BCC, the CCC, any oversight committee and group is distributing licenses en masse. Now, because of not in my backyard laws, NIMBY laws, a lot of retail stores or operations kind of they create clusters and density in certain areas, right?
yep,
And so
yep.
what you have is a big concentration of these local businesses, right? Seemingly selling the same thing, oftentimes selling the exact same thing, but at varying price points, right? Now,
Hmm.
what a lot of people don't realize about this progressive next kind of period that we're entering is it's
Yeah.
not that these individual businesses only are failing or need restructuring. It's the fact that a whole geography is
Yeah.
failing categorically. Like you have a regional depression, right? Like Youngstown, in industry past is a very good example. It's the same thing with cannabis domestically. And the thing that I'm always trying to be sensitive towards is sometimes it's not your issues are not self-inflicted. You have a good operating business, your partnership is solid, you've been very diligent, right? You work with Dope CFO as an independent third party that's doing a very good job of reconciling your books. You are on the straight and narrow from a margin perspective.
Yeah.
So, what's the issue? There's margin compression, right? There is saturation in your area. And fundamentally, you cannot compete anymore, right? You need to have 2.5 million at a minimum of revenue in order to be a going concern, and you're far below that. So all the machinations and mechanics of trying to change your business might not absolve you of the fact that the market you're in is going through a reset, right?
It
You are
happened
part of a
fast.
cohort and fast.
Yeah.
So, but here's the interesting thing, Ray. Like, and this is it's not the exciting part because I don't want to like try to glean something that isn't there. But think of it this way too, because it's a regional depression, right? Because you have parts of Massachusetts, parts of Michigan that are
Yeah.
as a collective going through it. Well, think about this. You still have a region that has qualified consumers, right? If you are one of 8 retail dispensaries in an area and you are able to start early and restructure and reformat your business for continuity, and as those other businesses as they go away, right? Unfortunately, however, whenever, the few that will be remaining will be able to service the geography unto themselves. So it's not consolidation by buying others. It's consolidation by collapse. You will be one of the few remaining in that geography. So what you used to be able not to get from a revenue perspective and a generation perspective will fall to you ultimately in small and large fashion. So it's a renewal process too at the same time. But you
Yeah.
have to start now, right? Restructuring work, you have to be very candid about what is fundamentally not working. And that's the hardest thing for a lot of people is the pride, some might say hubris, and admitting to yourself or your partners, anyone really around you that you need to make changes. A lot of people can't reconcile that because they thought it would always be on the up. So that's the first thing I would say to people, which is just start having a conversation with someone, whether it's us or somebody else, about what can be done. There's more benefit than you think.
And you might not be a good recruiter, but you're a hell of a salesperson. No, but in a good way. It's like the way that you explain restructuring is very intelligent, Mike. Like I say that with love.
That's
Like I
right.
completely agree with you because it's like people think it's such a negative and it's like, well, we got to start somewhere. It's like you've created something of value, you ran it for a couple of years. Like if we just do nothing, nothing will change. And then we'll just kind of continue this like slow decline into running out of cash. And so it's like, what needs to change? And then it's like just starting the conversation, I think, from a positive note is like much more kind of it just greases the wheels a little bit. And to your point, there is so much out of our control. It's like, well, we have to like fiercely control what we can. And like, yeah, we can have great product, but there is a ceiling of what we can sell it at. Like there just
Yeah.
is. And it's like we got to manufacture it so we can only cut costs to so much. And so like sometimes it is an actual like restructuring of the business. And it's like obviously like I have negative connotations with it, but it's like as I get more used to just M&A and valuation work and how this kind of works of like making companies be going concerns because I used to work for just a massive company that was around for 125 years. And then when I
Right.
audited companies, all the companies I audited were, 50 to 100 million, multi-generational manufacturing companies that have been around forever. And so it's like I kind of think of it as like in the startup world because it's like I feel like cannabis is very much a startup world. Like even though there's some companies that have been around for a while, it's like every month or year there's new markets where there's new cannabis companies being created. So it's just like being sensitive to like where the company has come from, what it has, and then just being realistic with the future, which sometimes is like a pulling off the band-aid type thing, but it's the only way to make it better.
Yeah, exactly. Hope's not a strategy, right? If you feel like you
No.
need to do something, you want to be proactive and preemptive before it gets too late. Like once you enter into a receivership experience, because again, we don't have access to bankruptcy. So,
Yeah.
it makes a lot of sense to try to be honest and thoughtful, but also meticulous. Bring in expertise and insight. The biggest interesting thing about cannabis, I would say, is the fact that there's so much subject matter expertise in the marketplace, right? There are a lot of people who can really improve your business that are available, right? That 8 years ago, there were not nearly as many people by a huge margin. There were not independent third parties that you could outsource to. Now, there are lots of ways in which you can kind of chart a better path if you're willing to have a candid conversation, first with yourself, then with your partners, and then with an outside perspective. But to sit around and to hope, right, for regulatory change with
Yeah.
this administration or otherwise, you're just you're being way too passive in my
There's always something to hope for. Like I remember when I started getting in the industry, it's like was safe banking, then it was rescheduling, now it's like descheduling. I'm like, all right, well, let's just run the business like nothing's gonna change. Man, I could nerd out with you all day, Mike. I feel like there's even a bunch of cool stuff that we didn't even get to, so we'll have to save it for another time. But just
yeah, no
being
problem.
mindful of your time, kind of, what are you excited about for the rest of this year? What are you gonna be up to in 2026, and where can people find you and learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, right on. What am I excited about? Hmm. I mean, I'm doing a lot of work in Minnesota. I think the thing that's interesting for all of the issues that you kind of have to unspool in pre-existing marketplaces, you always have a new market coming online. And people in Minnesota are absolutely lovely. Minnesota Nice is a very real moniker. Like people are awesome. Like they're, and again, like you always talk about these being like, these are regional businesses with regional communities. And Minnesota is wonderful. So I'm actually pretty pumped because it's such early days. And it's also cool to have people that have like such a fun twang talk about weed, right? So
Oh
I'm
yeah.
I'm really pumped for Minnesota. What's in store for 26? Uh, it's going to be kind of moment of truth. There are going to be a lot of businesses, large, small, public, private brands that, people have always talked about this thing, and it's hyperbole, but like an extinction event, that's overstated. Like, I don't
Yeah.
believe that. Also, that doesn't do anything for anybody.
Yeah.
This is the time and place where a lot of businesses that have been margin conscious, and operationally efficient, and hopefully have been good to their people and have been doing training development. This is where we see the next iteration of operator in this space that runs
Very cool.
lean, runs hard, and has a sophistication and an ability to make do given the constraints, right? So we're going to see the emergence of some seriously good dark horses that we haven't seen up to this point, which I'm pumped about because they probably have methodology that I can't even imagine. So for me, it's cool because it's almost like cannabis perfected in some instances.
Hmm.
How can people find me? You can reach me out on LinkedIn. The website's under, construction right now. It's being reconstructed, but people can reach out to me on LinkedIn, give me a shout. I'd love to talk shop, whether it's early stage participating business or a business that needs to be right sized, restructuring, reformatting a business. Maybe it feels like an ugly word, but it's not. I think it's a really
No,
good way
it's
for you to
not.
progressively get ahead of where you want to go.
Hey man, you've converted me. Now I'm kind of on team restructuring. I'm like, well, do you just want to go bankrupt? And like, that's not an option. So you just end up in receivership. So like, let's try to get ahead of all this via restructuring. Like, pick your R. It's either receivership or restructuring. I would say restructuring is probably better. Save receivership is like a last ditch resort. Man, Mike, thanks so much for your time. And I agree with you. Minnesota is a very friendly area in the Midwest. We're excited for it as well. And same with like Wisconsin. Like, we don't even have a medical program, but at some point, Wisconsin will be an exciting Minnesota type story. And yeah, 2026, let's stay in touch because there will be a lot of positive type restructuring. We're going to spin it on a positive note. But thanks so much for your time. And I'll see you around, Mike. Be well.
Thanks for having me, Ray. Be well. Bye.
Bye bye.